Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 63 of SCOTONOMICS. First thing I'd like to do is invite my co-host, Karen Van Sweden, on with me. Hello, Karen. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yes, very well. Very well. I had decided to take the weekend off. I went up to Girona with the family and watched the football game and had a look around the cathedral. And it was difficult to drag myself away because there was a Twitter chat about MMT and Tory MMT, as someone was suggesting. And I thought, am I doing the right thing going away and spending it with the weekend when this is all kicking off? And obviously the answer is yes. So I kind of dragged myself away from that for the weekend, looking forward to this week. How about you, Kieran? Everything going well with you?
We're busy. We have a by-election, and that's actually in the ward that I live in. So that's quite a busy time for us as well. But that's interesting about your Tory MMT, because, of course, there's a Tory MMT, which is tax cuts, which was what SCOTONOMICS was all about. And there's the left-wing MMT, which is spending on public services. Okay, so yeah, you can take your pick. I know which side I'm sitting on.
Yeah. No, it was a really interesting debate, and going into the details of it or the generalism of it was quite interesting. But thankfully, I didn't get too involved because we've got loads of stuff coming on. We've got an absolutely fantastic session for you tonight. But Karen, is there anything you wanted to have a quick chat about or mention before we get going?
Oh, well, the Bank of England have put up interest rates again.
Okay, and to mirror what almost every other central bank's doing. I think actually, now you mention that, it's probably just worth going into a little bit of detail for the audience about who sets interest rates. And a lot of people think that it's something called the bond market, that the demand for bonds sets the interest rate. Do you want to give us a little bit of detail or information on how the interest rate actually comes about and who sets it?
That's a decision for the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. They decide on that. So, that's where that comes from.
Yeah, it's as simple as that. The Bank of England sit down and they set a ceiling and they set a floor, and they try and keep the target rate within those two levels, and that gives you the target that they're after. It's not bond markets, it's not Liz Truss or any other government department. It's the Bank of England who set that rate, and that obviously takes you into the situation where you can look at rising interest rates and you can say this is a policy decision by the Bank of England, not to reduce the rates or not to keep them where they are, but to allow them to increase. So if we're thinking about who's to blame for high interest rates, you've got to look at the policy framework, which the central banks work within. They are ultimately making the decision, but they are acting on behalf of the central government. But no, I think that's really important to stress. It's not the market that sets the interest rate on government debt. It's the Bank of England that sets that rate. Let me know in the chat if anyone's like, really? Are you sure? Don't believe you? Or yeah, that's what I thought. That'd be good to hear. It's one of the kind of myths that we're going to look into during SCOTONOMICS Live, which I've just renamed the Festival of Economics rather than SCOTONOMICS Live. So I'll be really keen to hear.
Festival of Economics.
Festival of Economics, yes. We're going to be looking at a lot of issues, but we've got a fantastic myth-busting session, which will be part of our online coverage as well as our physical event. So these are the types of things we're going to discuss. We're also going to cover, of course, lots of things around currency and central banks. And Karen, Marla has just agreed to come and speak at 2 sessions for us virtually at the Festival of Economics. So we're absolutely delighted by that. Her contribution on the session tonight is absolutely fantastic. And it's really, really great that she's willing to support us on a couple of sessions as well. So that's really good news. And that just came through about 10 minutes ago. So you're the first to know, Karen, along with everyone else. Yeah. Okay, so the session we've got tonight is about 45 minutes. We've actually got another 10 minutes on the SCOTONOMICS YouTube channel, which looks at the currencies of the Caribbean in real detail. And I wanted to kind of separate that because a lot of the things that Marla talks about tonight, even though they're quite specific to the Caribbean, are also quite general in terms of central banks and monetary policy. So I wanted to kind of separate that out. It's a wonderful little adjunct to the session we've got. It is only 10 minutes, and I'll post a link to that if you get an opportunity to watch that this week as well. That'd be great. Okay, so this evening we're joined by Caribbean economist Marla Dukharan. And sorry, Marla, a few times I've put Marla Dukharan and your spelling, so I apologise for that. We had a little bit of chat online. She's going to discuss the Caribbean state's economic, culture and political journey since they became independent from European countries in the early 1970s. It's a story of the desire to secure as much sovereignty as possible, of microstates with tiny populations. 60,000 was one of the microstates you mentioned, tiny GDPs, managing their own country, and a lot of them are even, can you believe this, Karen, managing their own currency. Who would have thought it? Tiny countries been able to do that. Marla highlights the challenges these ex-colonial states had to overcome, especially in terms of nation building, because none of that had taken place during the centuries of colonial rule based on extraction of resources and riches. Marla outlines why there is nothing to fear from independence. We asked Marla, and this is in the video, are there any of these independent states trying to rejoin the UK's orbit? She laughed. Of course there aren't. Enjoy the show, and we'll look forward to chatting you and hearing your comments afterwards. It's a brilliant 45 minutes. I think you're really going to enjoy this. Karen, I'll speak to you after the episode. Bye for now, everyone. Marla, thank you so much for joining us on what's a momentous occasion for us, because it's the first time we've met. So thank you so much for being our other guest in the room. We're normally separated across geographical distances. Could you just start with just giving our audience a little brief introduction about why we've invited you onto the show today?
And why I'm here? I guess because I'm from the Caribbean and we have lots of former British and European colonies here in the Caribbean who have gained independence somewhere between 50, 60 odd years ago. So hopefully we have things in common to discuss.
I know this is a huge challenge and you could probably take days to explain this, but could you give us a little bit of an economic history of the islands from round about the 60s when they started becoming independent?
So first of all, we had thriving indigenous populations before the Spanish came to the West Indies. Christopher Columbus and his people, that is. So we had thriving indigenous populations, Caribs, Arawaks, and so on. And they were largely agriculture and fishing, small farming based societies. And then when the Europeans came, and there were long battles, long years of battles where you have countries changing hands from the Spanish to the French, Dutch, British, Portuguese, you name it. And basically we became sugar and plantation-driven economies, most of us. We have a few exceptions where, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, whilst we had sugar, which is where I'm from, by the way, we had sugar as well. But for maybe about 110, 115 years, we've also been an oil exporter. So one of the oldest in this hemisphere, actually. So the history of my country is a little bit different and a little more complex because of that. But anyway, suffice it to say, we were mostly sugar agriculture based, plantation economies. And then you had a transition that took place around the time of independence and a little bit beyond that, where we shifted a bit from being agriculture based to being service based. And what does that mean? Most of us diversified into tourism and also financial services. We still have almost every country on earth still has a tourism sector, but in some countries in the Caribbean, we are now the most dependent on tourism in the world. Aruba, for example, St. Martin, which are still Dutch jurisdictions, are the most dependent on tourism in the entire world as a percentage of GDP. And we still have some remnants of sugar production. We have quite a bit of it here in Barbados, but in some of the other islands in Cuba, in Dominican Republic, and so on, we still have quite a bit of that. You have other agriculture taking place in Suriname, Guyana, which are quite big, Trinidad as well. But less and less so in the small islands of the Eastern Caribbean do you find agriculture is important, I find, which is not a good thing. And during the pandemic, that reality really, it reared its head in terms of what a disservice we've done to ourselves in ignoring the agriculture sector. But countries like Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, as I said, Guyana and Suriname, Belize, have thriving agriculture sectors actually, and Haiti as well. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we do as well, but I guess less so for export than some of the other islands and territories in the Caribbean. And then, so most of us have been now 50 to 60 years independent. Trinidad and Tobago, 60 years independent last year. We're still heavily oil and gas based, whereas most of the rest of the Caribbean is more heavily tourism based. So less and less of an agriculture driven economy. So that's really a brief snapshot of our history. And of course, we have countries that are very much financial services dependent. So you have the British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Bahamas, Turks and Caicos Islands, Bermuda as well, although Bermuda is not really the Caribbean, but we do have some common history.
That's fascinating. And in terms of using the kind of base measure that we never particularly like to cover, but we use GDP. What's the GDP been like since independence?
That it's such an imperfect measure, and I'll give you one example why. When you look at GDP is used to measure as income per capita, and then you have this World Bank classification of low income, middle income, high middle income, and high income. And did you know that 2/3 of the world's poor actually are not in poor countries or countries classified as poor by this income stratification? 2/3 of the world's poor are actually in middle income countries. So that I'm just saying that to say that tells you how imperfect. Let's be generous here. Imperfect.
That's China, isn't it? Really, that's China that does that figure, really.
Yeah. So anyway, so in terms of economic progress, some of us have had really good outcomes when you look at human development indicators. So when you look at Cuba, for example, Barbados, in the post-independence era, those two countries, I think, have had the best human development outcomes as it relates to health and education and life expectancy. And most of us in the Caribbean saw improvements. So I'm just deviating a little bit away from GDP because we recognize how terrible a measure that is. But in terms of human development indicators, I'm pretty sure all of us have seen improvement in the post-independence era. But that's because also we started from a very low base, right? We were all extractive economies. You have colonies that were classified as settler colonies, and you have colonies that were classified or are classified as extractive colonies. Now, some people say that the extractive colonies in the Caribbean were, for example, Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, where the British predominantly, as well as other European colonizers, didn't really see this place as somewhere they wanted to settle and live and raise families and build communities for the long term. They just wanted to extract value, take it back to Europe, and live happily ever after. Whereas when you look at what happened in the United States, for example, that was clearly a settler type arrangement there. But when you really think about it, all of us were extractive colonies, simply because even though you didn't have oil and gas, you had sugar. It was about extraction. It was not about building a country. It was not about nation building. It was not about community building. It was not about creating the systems, the infrastructure, the laws that you need to have a prosperous society. It was about growing as much sugar as you could, harvesting the sugar, refining it to a certain extent in the Caribbean, or taking it back in more raw form to Europe to refine it there, and not really looking after the population that was here, which were largely, of course, ex-slave and ex-indentured labor population at the time of independence, right? So really, we were all extractive. And the fact that we were extractive tells you something, that there really was not that nation building until independence. And that's why we started from a low base. And there was that spending on human capital building and health and education and so on that we had in the post-independence era. And that's so, whereas, yes, GDP grew, but that's less important to me than saying that human development indicators is what really improved in the post-independence era until the early part of this century, until the global financial crisis in particular. We've seen some deterioration across the board in most countries. Some of that is lifestyle related, as when you look at the health outcomes, but some of that is also related to the economic problems that we suffered in this region, not just at the hands of the global financial crisis and other global phenomenon, but also, dare I say, domestic economic mismanagement that has led to less spending on the important things and more spending on debt servicing and so on, for example.
So it's interesting to me as well that you talk about the sugar, and in turn that sugar went over and fueled the workers in the factories in the UK, and obviously didn't give them proper nutrition, but what it did do, and the factory owners were very well aware of this, it gave them energy, and so they could work.
And they run too.
but they weren't really getting proper nutrition. So that's, that you see that the energy being made in the Caribbean, and perhaps also with oil, etc., and then the energy going over to feed the workers over here. And we were in that industrial process. Of course, it's completely changed now. We're much more of a service industry. So also the other thing we want to touch on as well is the tax havenery that's happening in the Caribbean. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that as well?
The first thing I need to say to both of you is that we're not the biggest or the best tax havens in the world, right? There is that very false global narrative that the Caribbean is full of tax havens. Actually, according to Tax Justice Network, the largest financial secrecy jurisdiction, I just need to use the correct terminology, the largest financial secrecy jurisdiction on earth is the United States of America.
United States, yeah, I was going to say that.
Yeah. And then Switzerland second. And then you have, I think in the top 8, I published it in my monthly Caribbean Economic Report today. You have Singapore, let me see if I remember it correctly. You have the United States, Switzerland, Singapore, Japan, Germany, Hong Kong. I could have gotten the order incorrect, but for sure the US and Switzerland are the number 1 and number 2. You have about 8 or 9 of them before you get to the first Caribbean one, right? So we are not by far the biggest or the best, most successful financial secrecy jurisdictions on earth. We are relatively small, but this industry really came about during the whole independence movement, where the UK decided that it wanted to create what is well known as the spiderweb arrangement, where you have London as the center, but certain transactions are channeled through the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Bahamas, Bermuda, to mask what's really going on and to sort of make it more difficult to trace certain transactions. And so that evolved, that whole industry evolved, and some of those countries are still part of the British empire, if you will, still part of the United Kingdom. So that was not necessarily something that is a big part. It isn't a big part of the independent states in the Caribbean. You have British overseas territories in the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, the Turks and Caicos Islands, and Bermuda, that are still part of the United Kingdom in some way or another. And they are actually the ones that are the most successful tax I don't like to use the word tax haven as well, because it does have this connotation that perhaps is not fair, but some of them are just tax neutral. Now, you have countries like Barbados that is independent, that has a low tax framework, not unlike Ireland, right? And the thing is, we are well within our sovereign right to decide what our tax framework looks like. The big countries that try to bully us into increasing our taxes themselves are larger tax havens than we are. So, but that industry came about not as a result of independent states saying they wanted this. It was really the UK creating this spider web with countries that still belong to the United Kingdom, even though they are here in the Caribbean. Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Turks and Caicos Islands,
protectorates.
Bermuda. Well, some are called overseas territories. I can't remember exactly what it's called. In Bermuda is, you know what? It's a constitutional arrangement that is not independent. We know it's not independent. What it really is can get a little confusing, but they're not independent states. They have a governor that's sent by the United Kingdom to be their head of state. I mean, they have elections where they elect their prime minister or premier, as they're called premier. But they're not independent the way Barbados, Trinidad, the Eastern Caribbean, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, they're not independent in that sense.
Okay. Well, that's the really good economic summary. I'm sure you say something similar, but independence isn't an economic argument or solely an economic argument. And even though we're an economics podcast, we cover economics in detail. We also, when we're speaking to small nations, as we speak about what the nation is able to do when it becomes independent. And certainly most of our speakers talk about the explosion of culture after independence. Is that something you are aware of happening in the states that you mentioned, Jamaica and Barbados in the 60s?
It's a very, very important question that you asked. And the reason it made me smile is that in my country, I consider us to be hypercultural, if you know what I mean. I mean, Trinidad and Tobago has the most talented people on earth with respect to song, dance, the music. We have rich music in Trinidad. I mean, calypso, the steel pan was invented in Trinidad because it was from a drum that you would export oil in. And that tells you the link between our economic history and our culture, right? And our food, and as I was mentioning to you before we went to the recording, we have a lot of ethnic diversity as well in Trinidad and Tobago and in Suriname. I think those two countries are the most ethnically diverse. Now, I cannot say to you whether there was an explosion of culture after versus before, because I don't know what existed before. But what I can tell you is that Trinidad and Tobago, I think, and Jamaica, and the island of Hispaniola and Cuba, so the bigger islands, have very, very strong cultural identities in terms of, I mean, reggae music and calypso music and soca music all came from this region, right? And have reached the whole world, and everybody loves this kind of music and have inspired different genres, including rap and others. And our people are, from a sporting perspective, also very successful, especially in Jamaica. But when I look at And I'm not saying this in any way to demean or to be negative. It's just an observation. When I came to Barbados, one of the things I noticed, because this was the country that was under British rule for the longest period of time of any independent state in the Caribbean. And the first thing I noticed here is that I don't feel like they have their own cultural identity the way that we have in Trinidad, and the way that the Jamaicans have, and the way the Haitians have, and the Cubans and the Dominican Republic people. I feel like there's a lot that's adopted from Trinidad. I mean, Trinidad is right next door. But the food and the song and the dance, I feel like it's almost absent here in terms of their own indigenous cultural identity. Very much a Caribbean identity, yes, but in terms of what is uniquely Bajan, I cannot tell you what is uniquely Bajan, and I think that some of that has to do with how long the British were here and how that influenced their culture, but also the fact that even post-independence, the influence of the British in this country was so strong. And is so strong that I feel that what might explain partially why there wasn't that explosion of culture that you talk about here in Barbados versus clearly what I see in my country all the time, So there might be a nexus there between independence and cultural explosion. I wouldn't doubt that, but for sure, it's also because of the ethnic diversity in these countries. When you go to Suriname, the kind of ethnic diversity there must have something to do with their culture and their song and their music and their food. Even in a little country like Curacao, though, which is still a Dutch territory, because they have a lot of ethnic diversity there and a lot of influence from Venezuela and, well, the South American continent in general, they have a lot of, I feel they have a lot of culture for a very tiny island. So I think it's not just independence. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we are so ethnically diverse.
The first Caribbean Economic Report was out today.
For this year, yes. It's the first one for this year. I've been writing this monthly report actually since I was at RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, quite some years ago. And basically what I try to do is to give a very brief snapshot of the last month's economic events in a handful of countries. Now, we are 20-something countries in this region, right? So I can't get them all down on paper and get them to fit in a size of publication that anybody is going to even look at. I don't know that anybody actually reads it, to be honest.
Well, we're going to link to it in our comments, so I guarantee you will get some people reading it from SCOTONOMICS.
Hopefully. But it basically gives you an overview of the last month or two of the mostly economic events and data coming out on growth and inflation, unemployment, balance of payments, import cover, reserves, things like that. It's the only publication of its kind that I'm aware of. And I'm willing to, and I'm always keen to hear feedback on it and ways that I can improve it. Everybody keeps asking, please, can you include this country or that country? I wish I could include everybody, but then I'll have to hire a whole team of economists. And this is a free publication. So anybody who's willing to sponsor and throw some money behind it, then for sure I'll add as many as I can possibly fit.
Well, we haven't got to it yet, but we definitely will. But I would imagine that certainly something you'd be covering that is the impact of the cryptocurrency collapse in the exchanges. And I know a lot of our listeners and those who are watching the show will already be aware of the particular connection between Barbados and crypto. Do you want to give us a little bit more detail in that? Because to us, it seems like something that Barbados and I think some of the other Caribbean islands as well were thinking, hey, this is our unique position. We can build our economy on this. Is that a fair reflection?
I want to make a distinction between cryptocurrency and digital currency. Barbados had the world's first, what the IMF termed synthetic central bank digital currency, or CBDC, right? And the reason it's synthetic is because it was not issued by the central bank. It was issued by a private entity, but it is regulated and supervised by the central bank and by the Financial Services Commission, two regulators, which is more than most regulated financial entities can say. So we issued this. When I say we, I was working at the time at BIT, which is the entity that issued this digital currency, which is called M-Money. And it's backed 101% by Barbados currency. And when you think about, let's boil it down to the why. Many people see the crypto space and digital currency space as sort of it goes against the system. It's anti-establishment, right? In this region, we don't care about anti-establishment, and we don't have the time for that. Really, it's about financial inclusion. And in some countries in the Caribbean, less than half of the population is financially included, meaning they have access to a bank account or a credit union account or somewhere that they can save their money. And if you are not financially included, you're more likely to be poor, okay? So financial inclusion is critical to solving poverty. You cannot solve poverty unless you solve financial inclusion. And most of us end up having, in some countries that have low levels of financial inclusion, most of us end up having to store our savings in cash and conduct transactions in cash. And that can be very risky, as you might imagine. So it was really that motivation, and not the motivation of this is how you can build an economy, or this is a get rich quick idea. It was really the whole, and even why El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender, and why El Salvador has passed legislation to allow them to issue their first bond in Bitcoin. It's really about financial inclusion for countries like ours. In other countries, in the European countries and in North America, the demand for crypto is much different in nature and in motivation, I would argue, than it is in countries like ours. Theirs is, again, anti-establishment, so it's ideological, but also speculative in terms of wanting to buy this and get in and see what money you can make. For us, it is largely being able to conduct transactions, including cross-border transactions. We have countries in this region that are heavily reliant on inward remittances from the diaspora in North America and in Europe. And some of these remittance receivers pay as much as 10% of these and these are the poorest people on earth, right? And they pay as much as 10% of the transaction. So this really is the motivation, the whole financial inclusion and conducting transactions. It was not an idea to, at least in the main, there are exceptions. It was not in the main driven by the desire for capital gains. Now, you've had, of course, the FTX scandal in Bahamas. And you've had various other collapses of exchanges recently following that, because you do have some contagion. But what I would say in the defense of the Bahamas is that FTX was regulated for less than a year in the Bahamas, and the Bahamian authorities were able to pick up, even though I think it's somewhere around 6 months that they had from the time FTX was registered and came into the Bahamas till this whistle was blown that, hey, something's going on here. It was a period of about 6 to 8 months, if my memory serves, certainly less than a year. So, while there are people who might want to point fingers at Bahamas and the Caribbean in general and say, we're a bunch of pirates and fraudsters and money launderers and tax evaders here, you have this narrative globally. Really and truly, this is a jurisdiction that did move quickly with very limited time, and of course, with very limited information in a short space of time. And I'm pretty sure that all of us will learn the lessons, not just the small countries, big countries too will learn the lessons of that FTX will bring, because this was not just a case of mistakes being made. This was outright fraud. Okay, and usually when there's outright fraud, there's somebody trying to cover it up. So by design, much harder to uncover. But in any event, I want to leave you with that idea that for us, digital currency and cryptocurrency is really about the transactions and the financial inclusion.
When you started the discussion, you were mentioning about the other areas, I think, of sovereignty that some of the Caribbean islands were lacking. So food sovereignty being a huge issue. I would imagine also energy sovereignty as well. Could you give us a little bit of background about how those countries, hopefully over a period of time, are trying to increase their amount of sovereignty?
Okay, so some of us we're microstates, most of us, right? And so the degree to which we can have food and fuel security, much less sovereignty, is very low. Back when we were becoming independent, there was the West Indies Federation and this wonderful idea of all of us former British colonies coming together to form a federation. And you would have a division of labor where, for example, Guyana and Trinidad will be the providers Trinidad would be the provider of energy. Guyana would be the provider of food, because Guyana is vast, right? Of course, the Federation, that whole idea fell apart. There's a story that we always say in the Caribbean where one country, Jamaica, decided they didn't want to be part of this federation, and they pulled out. And then my then Prime Minister, Premier, said he had some funny maths. He said, well, 1 from 10 leaves 0. And so then the federation fell apart. Anyway, but that idea still remains with us today. And we have CARICOM, where we are trying, especially during the pandemic and post-pandemic, trying very hard to see how we can drive intra-regional trade, greater levels of inter-regional cooperation, where food grown in this jurisdiction can easily be consumed and can be transported and traded across borders. The challenge we have is logistical, because we have the ocean separating us. We also have the challenge of egos and politics, and political will lacking to make some of the almost no-brainers happen. But we do have countries that are themselves independently fuel independent. Guyana is the world's newest oil exporter. Trinidad and Tobago produces oil and gas and does export oil and gas, but also imports refined product as well. But the thing is, you don't even have to have oil and gas, because we all have sunshine. So most countries are starting to think about, and also starting to amend legislation and put things in place in order to make renewable energy part of their energy mix. And so you have geothermal in some countries that would be viable, because we have tons of volcanoes. Dominica alone has 9 volcanoes, right? And so lots of potential for geothermal. And then we have potential for wind. We, of course, have huge potential for solar, and also wave as well. So that's something that each of these small islands can now think about their fuel and energy independence from the renewable standpoint, and that's great. From a food standpoint, most of us are just too small. However, too small to grow what we consume and to have a diversity in what we consume. But I spent some time last August in Dominica, and Dominica is one of those countries that people say if Christopher Columbus were to come back, he would still recognize Dominica. It's pristine. I mean, it was devastated by Hurricane Maria in 2017, and still you can see the effects of that. But people largely grow what they eat and eat what they grow in Dominica. And there's a huge drive towards self-sufficiency, sustainability, simplicity even in Dominica that I feel more of us in the Caribbean should emulate. And this whole idea of growing what we eat, eating what we grow, and being that much more sustainably minded is, I think, the way the future of our economies should go.
So leading on from that then, I wanted to know what the island's attitude was towards climate change and how climate change is affecting the islands.
Oh, listen, we're the hardest hit region on Earth. We don't call it climate change anymore. We call it a climate crisis. We lose about 2% of GDP on average every year, and that's if you're not hit by a hurricane. Not hit. If you're hit by a hurricane, then you lose, like Dominica did, in a matter of minutes, lost over 200% of its GDP, right, in less than an hour. And the IMF once did a study that found that even 20 years after an average storm hits, and an average storm is a roughly category 3, 20 years after an average storm hits, you can still see the effects of it in the economy, in the numbers, right? When a category 5 hits you, you can imagine what that 20 years would then go to probably 40, 50 years. It's a huge, huge problem for us. How do we, you might wonder, how is it that we're losing 2% of GDP every year if a hurricane doesn't hit? Well, we have that much more storms, which are not hurricanes, and rainfall that causes massive flooding. We have seaweed that clogs. I mean, when I was learning to surf a couple of years ago, I remember my surf instructor and I walking through waist high. I mean, I'm short, but still, waist high for me is still pretty high. Deposits of seaweed on the shore. We have to walk through that to get into the water, because the warmth of the seas, of the oceans, and also the amount of fertilizer being used in big countries like Brazil and others, that that fertilizer washes into the ocean and then causes an explosion of this bloom of sargassum that clogs our coastlines. And so we lose GDP to that, in the sense that you then have to deal with it, and then it affects your tourism product, and it clogs up waterways and so on. We also lose to drought. You've had countries that have had severe drought. Jamaica has gone through some of that in the last few years, and so that affects your crops. And so whilst, as you mentioned earlier in our discussion, the whole industrialization that took place in the global north was largely, or at least partly, fueled by, for example, the transatlantic slave trade and some of the industry that was taking place in the Caribbean, like sugar production. And that industrialization was financed largely by what was taking place in the Caribbean. And now we're suffering again the effects of the industrialization because of the Earth's temperature having gone up and continuing to go up post-industrialization. So it's really a challenge for us. There is a huge movement underway, led by our Prime Minister here in Barbados, to try to lobby big countries, the largest polluters historically, and the international financial institutions to change the way that they think about giving financing and lending for climate adaptation, because that's what we need now. We need climate adaptation. Everything we build has to be climate resilient. Otherwise, in a couple of years, it gets wiped out. And so it's a real challenge for us. We're seeing more and more people leaving this region. We already have a problem with brain drain. And more people leave this region because it becomes that much more difficult and costly to live here, because the insurance premiums are high. Your roof gets blown off, and then, that all of a sudden you are poor, because you now have to spend all of your savings fixing your roof, and then it can happen again in a couple of years. And so it's just an unsustainable situation, really, for us.
Hugely difficult and demanding economic decisions for you to make. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, I take it then everyone is desperate to rejoin the United Kingdom and have Westminster looking after their affairs again if things aren't looking so good at the moment.
I have not heard any such rumblings, no. You are seeing increasingly countries asking to become a republic. So Barbados is the world's latest republic, I think last year. Then we have Antigua, we have Jamaica, Belize, if memory serves me correct, those 3 or 4 of us that are looking to become republics. Trinidad and Tobago has been a republic for a long time. Honestly, in practice, it doesn't really make a difference. But I think in terms of our own national pride and confidence in ourselves, we have many times, I've talked to my colleagues about this and my friends in Ireland as well about this post-colonial insecurity, that we have. And I think that if anything, that's what becoming a republic might help with. And perhaps maybe more of that cultural freedom and expression that we also talked about earlier.
Well, I think we have that already in Scotland.
Yes.
Without having separated from the UK, and that we are a little bit concerned that we can cope, that we could have our own currency. There isn't a Republican movement here.
There is.
But certainly, it's not a policy that any of the main parties are pushing forward, and that does strike me as being a bit of a surprise, because if you want your independence, if you have confidence, then you'd be looking like the Catalan movement to start up to have the Catalan Republic, not just an independent country. So it's fascinating. So what you're saying is there's in no ways or any kind of demand to go back and seed this idea of independence. And even now there's a movement to try and remove these countries as far as possible from that domain that was the United Kingdom.
Especially with what has been happening in their political arena over the last few months. I mean, every country has its problems, right? But I don't know that it would add value, but there is no conversation around that. One of the things I will say, though, let's not kid ourselves. When there is a crisis, when hurricanes pass through this region, the countries that are not independent receive much more support. So Emmanuel Macron will be on a vessel over here in no time and land in Martinique and Guadeloupe and French Saint Martin. I've seen the Dutch do the same. Their response has always been, and so the British as well. The British, I think they used to have 2 vessels that sort of lived in this region in the hurricane season. I think last year they reduced it to 1. So you do see that they get support in certain ways. Certainly the Dutch territories, whenever they have a fiscal deficit to finance, the Kingdom of the Netherlands will finance it for them. And they get a tremendous amount of technical support and aid and so on. But these are very, very small countries that don't have capacity, don't have people that necessarily have the capacity to do what it takes, and never built that capacity because they're still a colony, right? Scotland is very different. Scotland is very different, and so I think you more than have what it takes. The other thing I want to say on this topic of independent versus non-independent, there are very few countries in this region that I haven't visited, and I must say that the countries that are not independent, I see less poverty, I see less hardship, and for the same reasons I just mentioned, because they get support from Europe, from whichever country they belong to in Europe. And so it means that they have that extra line of support and lifeline that we don't, and so we have to borrow, we have to raise funds and ask for aid and grants and so on. But there's another element to this. Remember, we talked about the whole division or dichotomy of settler colony versus extractive colony, right? And I think that because we were extractive, certainly Trinidad and Tobago, the institutions we had and that we were left with at independence were not fit for purpose. They were not designed to take this country forward and build this country into a prosperous society. And whereas the countries that are not independent, they still have institutional support from Her Majesty's Treasury and Her Majesty's Customs and Her Majesty's Army and things like that. And so, and judiciary. And that's a very important part of it. And so I think that it's, if you have the institutional framework in Scotland that can take you forward, right? And you have your people and you have expertise and technical capabilities, then why not?
Why not?
What a wonderful way to finish, and that's certainly how we feel, and it's been fantastic to have that echoed by someone as knowledgeable, but also so far removed from our discussions, because you certainly don't have any dog in the fight. So it's been really interesting hearing.
I do have friends in Scotland, and I so love your accent. And I have to tell you that the national drink of Trinidad and Tobago is what we call Scotch and coconut water, meaning Scotch whiskey and coconut water. If you've never had a Scotch and coconut water, you're missing half your life. And you need to come to Trinidad and have a Scotch and coconut water, and we'll toast with you when you become independent, right?
That sounds fantastic. Marla, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Have a wonderful week ahead.
Bye-bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that, everyone. Lots of comments. Please do drop any other comments or questions you want to drop in there. But yeah, it was such a nice way to finish that interview, wasn't it, Karen?
Scotch and coconut water. Yay. Looking forward to sipping that when independence comes.
Yeah, that might be the drink. That might be the drink of choice now. When I spoke to Marla afterwards, she was just saying, she had a few interactions with people on Twitter, pro-independence supporters as well as unionists, and she just said that this kind of ready to become independent kind of blues is something that she's seen in lots of different countries. This belief or understanding that we just can't quite do it without this bigger country supporting us. So she wasn't surprised that she got the reaction that she had from making quite a few positive statements about independence. But, I just found it as just really disappointing that there are people in Scotland who just don't think that we can do it.
Yeah. There was so much from that interview as well. It's nice that she likes our accents. I think our accent's absolutely gorgeous. It's like a soft verbal syrup. So she was talking about the institutional frameworks that we have in place as well, which should give people confidence. We are an old country looking to become independent again. We're not, a new country. And I think, with our own legal system, etc. as well. So it's not like we haven't been there before. I think that's important as well.
Yeah,
she was talking about the countries that have recently become republics as well, and how that's changed the mindset of people as well, which I think is really important too. And we do have a Republican movement in the UK as a whole, but the Greens are quite firmly Republicans, whereas at the SNP conference have voted to retain the monarchy. So that is SNP policy.
Yeah. No, I thought it was interesting that countries were looking forward to seeing how they could have more independence, more constitutional independence, rather than looking backwards to say, well, we've made this mistake, how can we go back to that relationship? And as we said at the start, she laughed. Marla laughed when we suggested that. Your point about institutions, I think, is really important, and we often hear from people that when you're looking at economics, it's not just about the strength of your economy; it's also about the strength of your institutions, and they're compared to what we can imagine the institutions were like in a lot of the Caribbean islands when they hadn't done any nation building. Scotland's in a very enviable position for a lot of other nations looking to become independent, and the rule of law and well known and respected. All these things really support case for Scottish independence. And as you all could hear there, Marla almost looked a little bit envious and jealous that we were starting off from the position we are considering, where a lot of the states that she supports had started from.
Yeah, I think the other important thing that she brought up as well was something we've discussed with the past guests, which is banking desert. Well, I mean, it's not even that a desert is forming there, it's that they just haven't really had the banking institutions there as well. But interestingly, I think banking in this country, in the UK, is changing, and I think a lot of especially younger people are moving towards different forms of banking too, whereas I think older people tend to sort of hang on to the older institutions that used to have bricks and mortar, even if they're abandoning their bricks and mortar premises now as well. That gives some comfort to older people. But yeah, that's something that I think is really important going forward, that people understand there are different ways to bank too.
Yeah. And you know, that's a good example of just some of the similarities and the differences. And certainly I want to finish by saying, in no way are we saying Scotland is similar to a lot of the Caribbean islands who became independent. What we're doing in the Small Nation series is just looking at small nations that have become independent. And I'm sure you can all see some similarities, but some huge differences as well. So hopefully that adds a little bit more to your learning and your understanding, and you can relate that to Scotland in terms of this idea of it being too small, too wee, too poor, too stupid, or whatever it is. And so many more countries who are smaller have managed and are doing well as independent nations. Well, thanks very much for joining us tonight. We really hope you can join us next week, because we have a live session. So we're live interviewing our guest next week. And that's going to be a really interesting discussion into the Edinburgh reforms, which are the kind of idea that Jeremy Hunt launched at the end of last year, on saying that the UK financial system needs more work and less regulation. And for some reason, he's called that the Edinburgh reforms, which I think are going to cause us a little bit of problem as we look at financial regulation in Scotland when we're independent. But that's a live interview with Nick. Is it Drysden? Nick Drysden, Kieran?
Yes.
From the I've forgotten the organisation he's from at the moment. It's a really good interview next week, but it's live, so please do join us. He'll be able to answer all your questions on that really important piece of potential legislation that will be going through the UK Parliament. Thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. Please do share, like, and comment on the episode, and hopefully we can get more people seeing that small nations tend to be successful and happy nations, small independent nations, that is. Kieran, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.
Night.